Thank you, Paul. One of the advantages of giving 3 lectures is to get 3 introductions. It's very good for the ego. Appreciate it. Overly generous. And again, thanks to Brian and those who have been instrumental in planning this series and making me feel so welcome. It's nice to be with you here in Winnipeg and on this campus. And I think I have figured out this device. So let's make our way through the mid-20th century. This morning, we tracked the story of oil and religion from the 19th century to the 1930s, across America's emerging extraction zones to Asia, and from the faith and politics of big oil, epitomized by the Rockefellers, to that of Wildcat Christianity. This evening, I would like to extend our story into the mid-20th century, when a fourth dynamic of Wildcat Christianity emerged, a dynamic I would call a spirit of rebellion. Of course, we already saw brief evidence of this spirit of rebellion in the clash that divided Lyman Stewart and the Rockefellers, conservative evangelicalism and liberal Protestantism. But the political facets of this fight truly rose to the surface after World War II. We will return in just a few minutes to the rise of Wildcat Christianity during the Cold War period. But what marked U.S. oil's most important turn at mid-century, one against which many oil patch Christians reacted, was a shift in productive focus to foreign fields. At this juncture, the balance of U.S. petroleum shifted in ways that frightened many Americans. No longer were they in control of the black stuff. For wildcatters and citizens of America's oil patches, this pivot was downright apocalyptic. Those leading the charge for wider prospects of this sort, however, saw only fresh opportunities. With the dawn of the hydrocarbon age and the rise of a hydrocarbon society utterly dependent on automobiles and cheap, abundant fuel, they couldn't help but view oil's global thrust as a necessary and good thing. And so during the 1940s, America's major oil companies, Texaco, Gulf, Standard Oil of California or Chevron, Standard Oil of New Jersey or Esso Exxon, Standard Oil of New York, Saccone, along with European powers, Royal Dutch Shell and Anglo-Iranian, British Petroleum, crafted strategies that could make the American people and government happy and expand their own profit margins. The focus of these 7 sisters, as they were known, was the Arabian Peninsula. The search for crude there began in the 1920s. With King Abdulaziz's blessing, British oil hunters consulted with Bedouin tribal leaders in an attempt to locate petroleum. God, the West's Jehovah, the Arabs' Allah, was omnipresent in these negotiations. For in order to locate Arabia's subsurface minerals, the West's major oil companies first had to learn Arabia's spiritual landscape, the holiest in Islam. God stayed present into the late 1930s as oilers affiliated with Standard Oil of California pressed harder for subsurface finds. In 1938, a strike in Al-Hassa province revealed the largest oil field in the world. With something momentous in reach, Standard California started growing its Arabian community, sending workers from U.S. oil patches to Al-Hassa. So it was that Christians from a devout American place encountered Muslim inhabitants of a devout Arabian place. In the early 1940s, shared optimism predominated as these operatives joined forces to find bigger pools. California Standard's 1944 decision to assume the name of Aramco, Arabian American Oil Company, manifested American-Saudi joint ownership in an epic venture. Even as other Standard subsidiaries came on board, U.S. majors recognized the need for another partner, Washington. In stepped Harold Ickes, U.S. Secretary of the Interior. Through Ickes' authority, Aramco negotiated special protections of U.S. investments in Saudi Arabia. Underpinning this deal was total certainty in the power of integrated oil companies and the federal government to orchestrate an international system that would universally realize democratic values, open markets, and modern means of resource management. Here was evidence, then, that the vision articulated by Henry Luce, who proclaimed the 1940s as the moment Americans would make the 20th century its century, and bestride the world as theirs to guide, to manage, and to develop, that this vision would become a reality, not simply an empty boilerplate promise. Luce's key ally in this regard was William A. Eddy. Eddy was the son of Presbyterian missionaries who had helped found the American University in Beirut. At home in this Paris of the Mediterranean, he internalized the desires and the discourses of the pro-Arab Americans who flourished there in the early 20th century. He would make it his life work to share that appreciation of the Middle East in hopes of strengthening its ties to the West and, more importantly, its future of democracy and development. Eddy's early career further strengthened this goal. Trained at Princeton, Eddy eventually assumed the presidency of Hobart College. As president of this small liberal arts college, he traveled on behalf of his school and on behalf of his political ambition. In 1940, he lectured widely on the power of God and the secular world. His message implored lay people to transform each sector of the globe, even those considered secular. The message was soaked with urgency precipitated by war's rising dictatorial states. Quote, "You and I who believe in Christendom are not doomed to weakness," he wrote, and he offered. "We serve the only totalitarian king. We who follow Christ need to cover ourselves with tolerance, reverence, and charity, and then wherever we walk, we shall find ourselves standing on holy ground." Eddy also spoke on behalf of U.S. Major Oil and Washington's efforts to open up Arabian oil fields. No mere profit seeker, he spoke from the soul about the need to harness big oil to loftier ambitions of global economic development. Because of their technological superiorities and unmatched understandings of universal terrains, Major Oil and its supporters now shouldered a responsibility to think as collaborators, as citizens of the world. The kingdom would be theirs only if the blessings of the black stuff were shared. He didn't just talk to this point, he acted on it. In the mid-1940s, Eddy assumed a key role as special envoy for the U.S. State Department. For 5 years, he monitored Saudi Arabia's vulnerable oil fields and nurtured relations with its prince. In February 1945, on a ship in the Suez Canal, he helped broker a deal between Saudi Arabia and Franklin D. Roosevelt, guaranteeing a partnership in petroleum and petropolitics. Eddy's subsequent career became testament to the potency of his liberal internationalist vision. As a consultant for Aramco and an Arabist in sympathy, he promoted peace between Western and Saudi interests, shared mutual trust and fiscal ambition, and respect for the divine. So Eddy's efforts, one could say, paid off. With his steadying influence, Aramco became petroleum's greatest success story yet. By the 1950s, oil fields of unprecedented volume were being discovered around Iran in the eastern province. In short order, this area became the site of some of the most remarkable exchanges between American and non-American oilers and citizens. Indeed, in the 1950s, Aramco's camp acquired the feel of a 1950s American suburb, with much more hanging in the balance. There, American engineers, geologists, and drillers and local tribes together came to anticipate a near future in which crude would truly be a transnational force for progress. There, American oil families came to occupy the front line of a post-war phenomenon that promised to remake the world. Their hope and labor, even children were invested, was that their encounters would strengthen universal brotherhood and service. Recognizing the dawn of oil's new age, Aramco officials meanwhile made it clear to their employees and to their investors and their government sponsors that while the U.S. could no longer stand alone in the realm of oil, it could and would stay out front of its rapidly advancing influence. And once again, it was the Rockefeller family that truly embodied these aspirations. During the 1940s, John D. Rockefeller Jr. continued to take the lead of an already impressive philanthropy. Besides funding the Ecumenical Federal Council of Churches, he also endorsed the most important internationalist initiative of all, the United Nations. His foundation also supported the Council on Foreign Relations, which counseled Washington on present crises and prospects of peace around the world. This sense of mission got an added boost in 1940 when a third generation of Rockefellers, John D. III, Nelson, Lawrence, Winthrop, and David, founded the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which would become pivotal to the family's philanthropic proselytization in the second half of the 20th century. Of the five brothers, none was more important in linking oil to economic development in the Third World than Nelson Rockefeller, whose work with inter-American affairs placed him at the forefront of U.S. plans in South America. Within the Cold War context, Nelson's agenda assumed real urgency. In his mind, as in Eddie's, oil's beneficence had to be exploited and propagandized before the U.S. lost its global authority. Though not outspokenly religious, Rockefeller was a man who harbored deep convictions and longed to use his family's petropower to reshape the Southern Hemisphere in an image of democracy. He believed that his civil religion of crude would stymie communism and anti-colonialism's influence there and ensure America's place at the head of a new international order. Back to the Wildcatters. Even as William Eddy, Aramco, and Nelson Rockefeller were busy on foreign fields trying to connect American economic and political interests to a philosophy of third world economic development, back on North American soil in the oil patches of the Southwest, their counterparts were busy too, forging a revolt. An emerging class of wildcatters, the likes of which had never been seen, dictated this agenda. And their origin story returns us to the Depression-era Texas, East Texas in particular, which we discussed earlier today. There, the rise of the wildcatter to cult status grew out of the region's Pentecostal ethic, eschatological urgency, and technocratic sensibilities. In this booming oil's high-risk game, in which a man could become a millionaire or a pauper in less time than it took him to light a cigar, a handful of men emerged with trump cards and cigars in hand. And they included, of course, Texas's big rich, poor producers who could only drill in shallow pools like those of East Texas, yet somehow still managed to make it big, really big. And among the Texas's big rich, of course, are four names that stand out: Hugh Roy Cullen, Clint Murchison, Sid Richardson, pictured here on the horse, and of course H.L. Hunt. None among them captured profits and attention like Haroldson Lafayette Hunt, H.L. Hunt, the man who bought fields from cash-strapped drillers and gained control of the epicenter of the East Texas field. Although these warrior heroes, in Max Weber's rendering of an alternative to the Protestant ethic, altogether they proved that with a little, more than a little luck, a lot of faith, and much dogged persistence, anyone could thrive in their own fates. It is in this context that the wildcatter spirit of rebellion grew in scope politically. Wildcatters facilitated revolt through a range of religious and political associations, including their churches, but especially the Texas Producers and Royalty Owners Association, or simply TIPRO. TIPRO's members identified a number of threats to their livelihood in the 1930s and the 1940s. First, of course, was the steady expansion onto their soil by major oil companies. Second were these companies' attempts to impose control of local production, which remained, thanks to the rule of capture, quite chaotic. In part, they attempted to do so by implementing conservation controls. If sympathetic to majors read on this crisis, wanting a good price for their oil and willing to contribute to conservation, independents, wildcatters, believed that Standard and its partners were ultimately after something else, complete control. The man at the head of the entire crusade for major oil, their third major threat, seemed to promise this. And that man, again, was Harold Ickes, Secretary of the Interior, who sought to impose order on East Texas's oil fields through government regulation and a working partnership with a few majors in a way that he saw would streamline the industry and make it more efficient. East Texans, on the other hand, viewed him as an antichrist, quite literally, trying to bring both Leviathans, Washington and Big Oil, down upon them. Ickes' aid of major oil's prospects abroad in Saudi Arabia, all at the cost of domestic production, made them even more livid. Enter Sunoco, Sun Oil Company's J. Howard Pugh. The Pugh family, as you'll recall from brief mention of Joseph Newton Pugh this morning, a product of Western Pennsylvania and the first oil fields of the late 19th century, had always operated on the conviction that individuals bore the responsibility for their condition, and that large governing bodies, be they oil conglomerates or Washington, worked against that principle. J. Howard Pugh took this doctrine to another level of certainty, and in the early Cold War years turned sentiments of dissent into a hard-fast strategy of political revolt. And again, this is something that J. Howard Pugh came naturally to, again, considering his father's heritage, but also the company culture that his father helped nurture in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, a culture of applied Christianity. Joseph Newton Pugh was known to encourage, not just encourage, but enforce his workers' attendance at local revivals, major ones as well, held by D.L. Moody and Billy Sunday. So J. Howard Pugh, of course, felt very comfortable in continuing this company culture into the 1950s. When addressing company gatherings, he was known to deliver sermons on the origins of the King James Bible or critiques of modernist theological trends. His character also spoke to the ways in which this spirit of dissent came naturally. A Cornell-trained engineer, he was known for his steadfastness. Some would say his stiffness. One of America's senators at the time quipped that J. Howard Pugh not only talks like an affidavit, he looks like one. With the bushy eyebrows, you can see the point. And then, of course, his executive acumen was also notable. Throughout the 1920s, J. Howard Pugh avoided the stock market. Part of his Wildcat philosophy was cash is king, and refused to make daring investments in some regard within the stock market distant in New York. After the collapse of the stock market in 1929, he therefore had a lot of cash to spend in the 1930s, and Sunoco, in fact, grew substantially during the 1930s as a result. Sunoco's place in East Texas, something that Pugh took seriously, was also important here. The company invested heavily in the area, was instrumental in the construction of the Big Inch pipeline, was also instrumental in conservation controls implemented at the local level, and was also known for its favorable labor and public relations. During the 30s, for instance, very rare at the time, Sunoco extended employee stock options, life insurance, and social programs, and in fact kept all of its employees on the payroll at an above average income throughout the Depression. So during the 30s and 40s, Sunoco became the media darling, the entity cited by Texans as an example of what to do right. Square dealers, as one newspaper man described them, Sunoco's executives were the antithesis to standards men. They abided by rules of conservation, but with concern for local people and their environment. They took care of workers as well as the little man and royalty owners with whom they collaborated. When a Southwestern preacher prayed for God to bless the pure and humble in area oil fields, here referencing Pure Oil Company and Humble Oil Company, a roughneck interjected, "Don't forget about Sun Oil." Pugh's ability to marshal Texas sentiments allowed him to reach far beyond these parochial spots to a wider evangelical public in the late 1940s and early 1950s. By this time, Sunoco's status had changed. Although still regarded as an independent company, in reality, Sunoco had become a global mid-major. By 1950, it was refining in Canada and Venezuela, carrying a payroll of 20,000 persons worldwide, and playing the great game of Cold War exploration. Pugh's own standing, meanwhile, also changed. In 1947, he retired as CEO. While he would continue to wield power on Sunoco's board, his flexible job description allowed him to focus on another goal: countering Rockefeller influence in philanthropy. The outlet for his charity was Pugh Charitable Trust, established in 1948, as well as a separate trust that he managed under this umbrella organization, the goal of which was, quote, to acquaint the American people with the evils of bureaucracy and the vital need to preserve a limited form of government, to acquaint the American people with the values of a free market, the dangers of inflation, the paralyzing effects of government controls on people, and to promote the recognition of the interdependence of Christianity and freedom. Nothing subtle about that. Pugh may not have been able to match the Rockefellers in output, but he sure tried, opening up his coffers to thousands of requests from small and large institutions that shared his conservative religious and political beliefs. No institutions were more important to him than those affiliated with the new evangelical movement, which began in the 1940s and was centered on the National Association of Evangelicals and the ministry of Billy Graham. The NAE's mission echoed Pugh's, as was evidenced in the words of its intellectual light, Harold Ockinga, who charged at the founding conference that evangelicals would no longer suffer because of the terrible octopus of liberalism. During the early Cold War years, NAE-aligned institutions like Christianity Today received hundreds of thousands of dollars in support from the oilmen. Individual leaders within New Evangelicalism also relied on Pugh. Such was the case with Charles Fuller, the famous evangelical radio preacher and founder of Fuller Seminary. By the early 50s, Fuller Seminary was floundering. Fuller tried his hand at oil in hopes that some quick strikes would garner him the needed funds. Set up shop in Oklahoma and in California. But his company, which he named Providential Oil, faltered, leaving him distraught. Why, he asked God, were his pipes filled with sand? On Ockinga's advice, Fuller petitioned Pugh for help, and Pugh answered with a check in hand. One of Pugh's allies in his call to support New Evangelicalism was R.G. Letourneau, an evangelical businessman with Canadian heritage and an engineering mindset. He was one of the U.S.'s leading manufacturers of earth-moving machinery whose millennialist capitalism mirrored Lyman Stewart's, which we heard about earlier today. As fast as he made money, he gave it away, some 90% of his earnings total. Letourneau achieved his influence during World War II when he produced 70% of all earth-moving equipment used by the Western Allies. He augmented it by relocating to Longview in East Texas, where he started building machinery for the post-war world's largest oil patches. As he articulated while speaking to the 1951 World Trade Conference, the machines he exported promised a new order sanctioned by Scripture. God gave us the raw materials to work with for nothing, he said, and there is plenty to be had if we go to work and produce the things we want. His reach, too, like Pugh's, expanded in the 1950s, both at home and abroad. He, for instance, got in the business of building movable offshore rigs for George H.W. Bush's Zapata Oil Company, christening here pictured. He also built roads in Peru's jungle for oil exploration. In exchange for his services, Peru's president and the presidents of Gulf and Mobil Oil awarded him land on which he could start his own model community of capitalism and Christianity, which he called Terna Vista. At his technical institute in Longview, meanwhile, he trained students in the, quote, spiritual requirements of the modern age and the practical needs of a technical age. Then sent his graduates all over the globe as engineers, pilots, and missionaries, some of whom worked with Wycliffe Bible translators and Mission Aviation Fellowship. Like Nelson Rockefeller, but with explicit religious goals, LeTourneau was intent on opening up the jungles of South America to evangelism and modernization, initiatives that implicated oil exploration. Wycliffe and MAF's use of shell oil camps to reach the isolated Huaorani or Auca tribes of eastern Ecuador was one example of this collaboration. The resulting murder by this tribe of 5 missionaries in 1956 stunned LeTourneau, yet reaffirmed his resolve to draw the world's lost peoples and their hidden riches into God's divine plan. Pugh and LeTourneau's sprawling ambitions often centered on the work of Billy Graham, a man whose friendship both cherished. Graham welcomed their overtures. Not unlike Charles Fuller and other preachers, he was enamored of the financial potentials of Texas crude and saw it as an economic lifeline for his ministry. And his high opinions of oil were nurtured by his proximity to Texas's wildcatters. His proximity came through various means, including family. Ruth Graham's side was very firmly entrenched in some of the leading churches in Dallas and Houston, giving Billy Graham, again, access to economic elites in those areas. He also, of course, held membership at First Baptist Church, pastored by W.A. Criswell, attended by the Hunts and the Murchisons, and also developed a very close relationship, especially with Sid Richardson. In the 1950s, Ladies' Home Journal profiled America's 10 richest men, 6 of whom, plus 2 honorable mentions, worked in oil. Through his ties to Texas and J. Howard Pugh, Graham knew at least 4 of them. As his ministry evolved into New Evangelicalism's flagship, the evangelist leaned on these men and their business. He also used them as allegory for his gospel. In the face of communism, secularization, and the all-powerful major companies and liberal Protestant church, whose calls for centralized, coordinated action upset their sense of liberty and autonomy, evangelicals needed to fight back. So Graham and his allies entered the realm of image-making. Now, Graham, of course, was hardly alone in his fantasies of Texas tea. As the lifeblood of their hydrocarbon society, oil captivated all Americans in the 1950s, even as its excesses also reminded them of the dangers of abundance. Hollywood producers captured the mood by translating several melodramas about Texas crude onto the silver screen. Most famously, of course, they filmed Giant, produced in 1956. Through the rise and fall of Jet Rink, played by James Dean, a poor boy turned filthy rich by crude, movie fans got a glimpse of how oil was at its essence impure because it served no other end but greed, imprisoned even well-meaning people in materialism, and forced its practitioners to jettison true happiness and basic human values. In order to address this misperception, Texas's oilmen had to locate a substitute image, one that showed them to be America's purest capitalists who did not trade principles of community and collective well-being for profit, or morals for an edge in the marketplace, but stayed true to oil and the free enterprise's founding vision. Working with Graham, on whose ministerial board he sat, East Texas wildcatter Earl Hankemer, pictured on the bottom right, helped produce a Christian movie alternative titled Oil Town, USA, which was released in 1953. Its story revolved around Lance Manning, who, much like Jet Rink, fell victim to oil's excesses. What differed, however, was that Manning made his way through the trials of greed and ruthlessness that tore up his life toward Graham's teaching and acceptance of Christ. Having walked the sawdust trail, he became a wealthy fount of charity. Such was the redemptive power of a gospel attached to the boundless possibilities of crude. This film helped sell a message of salvation from sin, but it also sold subtler truths. One was that America's future should, be determined by a region flush with resources and free market verve. As the movie's advertisements proclaimed, you may have wondered, why a story about Houston? Why not Pittsburgh, Chicago, Boston, or Atlanta? Well, the story of Houston is the story of the free enterprise of America, the story of the development and use of God-given natural resources by men who have built a great new empire, and with it, a fabulous central city, Oil Town. Another message followed, that the independent oilmen were examples of pristine capitalism and muscular Christianity in society's fight against communism and a secular state. In a time of distress, Americans could look to these citizens of Oil Town, USA, as models of citizenship. Politics, too, accompanied this message. During the 1950s, just as Oil Town was being produced, Graham and his allies orchestrated a critical shift in the nation's partisan alignment. The driving issue was government control of the tidelands, offshore oil in the Pacific and Gulf of Mexico. At President Truman's command, Washington laid claim to this zone during the late 40s, causing uproars in oil-rich states like California and Texas. The land grab, as its detractors chimed, not only indicated an encroaching federal state, but also conjured worry about the loss of oil revenues that states had been using for things like public education. As California Republican Governor Earl Warren offered in 1948, this was a matter of family values and tradition, states' rights and local control, not simply about finances. With Sid Richardson and Graham playing key roles, Warren's warning became a mantra Dwight Eisenhower and the GOP exploited for the 1952 campaign. Independent oilmen's earlier pleas for better representation with the Democratic Party and then attempts to woo Republican candidates had failed. 1940 GOP candidate Wendell Willkie not only rejected them, he ridiculed them. The good Lord put all this oil in the ground, then someone comes along who hasn't been a success at doing anything else and takes it out of the ground. The minute he does that, he considers himself an expert on everything from politics to petticoats. In 1952, these petro-patriarchs finally had their man and their party. While Graham implored Eisenhower to run, Richardson recruited his deep-pocketed friends. In Texas's churches and independent oil associations, meanwhile, the charge for good Americans to upend the federal Democrats and regain title over the tidelands oil deposits reverberated pew to pew, local chapter to local chapter. The result was an Eisenhower victory and the first major inroad by the Republican Party into the solid Democratic South. It would set in motion mechanisms of an even more profound and lasting power shift yet to come, which we'll discuss tomorrow morning. For all their heavy lifting in popular culture and politics, the men at the center of independent oil and evangelicalism thought mostly about economic development. Nothing drove them more than a sense of crisis created by U.S. major oil's moves abroad. It now seemed that independent oil's future was in doubt because of depleting domestic reserves, imported crude, and disregard for the values of wildcat capitalism. So they stepped up their hunt for new oil on continental soil. And two progressions in the late 1940s proved absolutely critical for them. First, the firm of Kerr-McGee, co-owned by Oklahoma Governor and Senator Robert Kerr, made industry history by tapping oil in the Gulf of Mexico. Determined to prove that offshore development was possible and that risk-taking independence should lead the charge, Kerr-McGee ventured 10 miles off of Louisiana and from a platform of surplus warships fished for its prize. Heralded for opening up offshore oil, Wildcatters also revered Kerr for being a leader in the Southern Baptist Convention, eager to supply charities with his profits and preach on the virtues of man's use of Earth's resources for kingdom-building projects. Perhaps the only man who matched him on these counts was Alberta Premier Ernest Manning, a man whose reputation rose with a second turning point, the 1947 discovery of the Leduc oil field near Edmonton. Within days of the find, petroleum companies were investing heavily in Alberta. By year's end, 31 wells were pumping 3,500 barrels per day from the field. Though modest, the numbers proved that Alberta was a new player in international petroleum. The Leduc strike was key for embattled independence. Proximate and overseen by a politician who shared their values, the breakthrough struck these oilers as a spectacular opportunity for their business, politics, and for their faith. Here was an accessible frontier from which they could reap profits and sell the virtues of local crude to a North American citizenry pressed by Cold War anxieties about controlling foreign influences, be they Saudis or Soviets. Cognizant of this, Manning began shoring up north-south cross-border ties and making his dominion a wildcatter's paradise. He did this while staying true to his own roots, which were nurtured in Alberta's Social Credit Party, the most successful populist movement of the 20th century. And as you probably know, and I think assume basic knowledge here of Manning's illustrative history and social credit, something I can't assume south of the 49th. But Manning's mentor was William Bible Bill Eberhart, who founded a Bible school, preached on the radio in the 1920s and 30s, called Back to the Bible Hour, and also pursued politics with the same zest through his Social Credit Party, which adhered to a platform of radical monetary reforms and economic redistribution, anti-centralization, local autonomy, and community values. In 1943, following Eberhart's sudden death, Manning ascended to his mentor's political post. Manning used his new authority to advance Eberhart's dogmas, though in tempered form. Whereas Eberhart was a fundamentalist who waged war for his beliefs, Manning was an irenic evangelical who bore witness to them in a diplomatic tone. This combination made him instant allies with American clerics and laymen associated with the new evangelicalism. Between 1943 and 47, he in fact made it his mission to enlist in several new evangelical undertakings. With friend R.G. Letourneau, he organized branches of the International Christian Businessmen's Committee, spoke on behalf of the Gideons and Billy Graham, sat on many ministerial boards, and saw to it that America's leading revivalists made their way north to Calgary and Edmonton for mass meetings. Manning's pause from the work of his office to host Charles Fuller on a 3-day provincial speaking tour in 1947, which overlapped with the Leduc strike, typified his resolve to prioritize faith initiatives. Yet Manning never considered the political secondary. We cannot purify polluted water in a well merely by painting the outside of the pump, he would say. Purification needed to happen first through a personal relationship with God, but second through a willingness to act vigorously for social reform. His message that statecraft and faith should mix and that Christian citizens needed to take ownership of their communities stirred the masses at home, but also in the United States. As I travel, he offered in 1950, I frequently meet those who think it's strange that a man in public life should be interested in the Bible. I wonder why. If you are a realist, he wrote, you cannot deny the fact that beneath and behind all our human and material problems, there lies the basic problem of man's broken relationship with God. Manning, in turn, became a hero, embraced by evangelicals in the U.S. as a symbol of applied Christianity. One South Carolinian expressed the common sentiment when writing, "We appreciate your testimony and your Christian influence. We believe the Lord has great plans for you." As Manning's reputation grew, so did the volume of mailed requests for autographs, photos, or his latest speech. American oilmen were equally welcoming of Manning and his message. Even as he continued to crisscross the continent in the 1950s, advancing evangelical Christianity, he assumed a more pressing schedule of business engagements with executives, engineers, and politicians in the Southwest. Preaching in the region's churches on Sunday, he sermonized in its oil associations Monday through Friday. Substantively, his message in both venues contained several key elements. First, it endorsed a share the wealth spirit that resonated through social credit. Manning was a free enterprise with a plain folk edge. He demanded that his people get a fair share of petroleum's lucrative pie through royalties and regulation. U.S. oilmen criticized Manning's policies as heavy-handed, eventually forcing him to compromise. But even in their critiques, they celebrated Alberta's stand against big oil. In this Canadian outpost, they saw a politician who was staring down the tyranny of monopoly. Second, Manning was a technocrat who heralded the power of the engineer to remake his province, his region, his oil patch into the magnificent form God intended for it. This perspective, which he eagerly shared any time he traveled south or welcomed American oilers to Alberta, he would often welcome them to the Texas of Canada. This allowed him a special hearing with petroleum guilds and enabled him to strike a chord with wildcatters. those he considered blessed for being able to operate in the dirt, grease, and splendor of their immediate environment. And there was yet a third aspect of Manning's ideology that resonated with the Wildcatter, and that was its connection to cosmic purpose. As a premillennialist with technocratic sympathies, he decoded signs of societal strain as evidence that Christ's return was nigh. His testimony was clear and clearly stated in evangelicalism's leading magazines, like Billy Graham's Decision magazine, a quote of which is before you here. Alberta is the great oil-producing province of Canada, yet every time I look at an oil well and see the pump going up and down, I say to myself, someday that well will be pumped dry. But there is a cruise of oil which will never run dry, one that will flow on forever and ever. We should be anxious for people to know about the oil, which in the lamp of God's word produces a light that shines across the darkness of this world in order that men may find their way to Jesus Christ, the one who alone can save and who can solve their problems, whatever they may be. In this way, Manning wedded his eschatology to the crisis theory of peak oil, advanced at this very time by geologist M. King Hubbert, which held that U.S. production would crest by 1971 and then decline. The apocalyptic feel of this prediction further convinced Manning that the world was entering its last phase. Not only did time seem to be running out on America, it was now favoring non-Christians located in the very place to which Christ would return, the Middle East. His response was to keep his people's eyes glued on the Middle East, where rising oil production, the dawn of Arab petropower, and an embattled Israel seemed to portend Christ's return, and to encourage Albertans and their oilers to extract expeditiously and efficiently whatever oil supplies were under their soil before their dispensation expired. Perhaps this is why Manning turned to one of America's supreme wildcatters when contemplating his province's most ambitious advance into global crude, the winding tale of which I'll use as a close to this talk. This advance involved the 54,000 square miles of muskeg that surrounded Fort McMurray in northern Alberta, and the initiative of 4 individuals that we have already encountered in our journey through this mid-century stage of Wildcat Christianity's political ascent: Ernest Manning, J. Howard Pugh, Billy Graham, and R.G. Letourneau. Encouraged by Alberta's foray into international oil, yet concerned about his province's need to grow its oil sector, Manning tried to anticipate next steps. Carl Clark, chief metallurgist and proponent of the Athabasca oil sands, nudged him in the new direction. After further perfecting a hot water process of refining the sands, something that he had been working on for decades, Clark announced that the time had come for a move by the government. Wanting to extend Alberta's petroleum profile, yet wary of spending the exorbitant extreme funds needed to extract usable oil, Manning solicited the corporate sector. J. Howard Pugh soon appeared, again with checkbook in hand. In his Philadelphia headquarters, he had organized his fascinations with Alberta in a file labeled Athabasca Tar Sands, which he excitedly showed anyone who would oblige him. In 1952, he pulled his stuffed file out once more, marveled at the possibilities, then committed $250 million to Clark's technology and the creation of the Great Canadian Oil Sands. Besides breaking company records, this payout represented the largest private investment at the time ever made in Canada. For the next decade, Pugh and Manning anticipated Great Canadian Oil Sands' grand opening when it could generate dividends on the large investment. In the early 60s, the time for payoff had arrived. Sunoco and the Canadian Oil Sands were ready, with technology and financing in hand, to start building a massive plant that could refine the viscous soil dug out of Fort McMurray's bogs. The payout, however, was not forthcoming, as final negotiations between Alberta and Sunoco stalled. Between fall of 1963 and the spring of 1964, Sunoco officials pressed for government permission to mine the tar sands. Enthusiastic, yet ever the populist, Manning was nervous about how an American company would be received by rank-and-file Albertans. And so he insisted that Sunoco's development of the sands come with concessions. At very least, a pipeline that suited Alberta's economic and environmental interests, a pledge to hire local labor, and an agreement that Alberta residents be afforded an opportunity to purchase up to 15% of the initial equity stock of the company at the same price and on the same terms as Sunoco's private investors. Albertans, Manning asserted, were not going to give American business a free pass. Sunoco hedged, expressing worry that government enjoyed the upper hand. Besides imposing the extra burden of public investors, which added risk to an already risky enterprise, the Manning plan also seemed to compromise principles of free enterprise. One official summed up his company's worry. Government is involving themselves in affairs of private enterprise to a peculiar degree. Here, enter Billy Graham. With Graham serving as mediator, Pugh and Manning began exchanging letters, and soon the correspondence assumed friendly talk about the Bible. In his missives, Pugh told of an upcoming church conference, forwarded favorite theological texts, and asked if he could use Manning's sermons, no doubt in company settings. Manning responded by sending the sermons, along with thanks for the books, which his son Preston was now perusing with great interest. In another letter, the politician encouraged the oilmen to continue fighting for the fundamentals. The need for aroused Christian laymen to take an uncompromising stand for the faith once delivered was never greater than at the present time, he wrote, particularly since so many pulpits have become mouthpieces for liberalism and even the outright denial of the divine authorship of Scripture. Finding that their theology was similar, even if their politics varied in areas, Pugh and Manning grew closer. In 1964, they shook hands alongside the Athabasca River, linked not just by business interest, but also by common commitment to Jesus Christ. These two diplomats met again a few months later in Jasper, Alberta. This time, Graham joined them. When congregating in the Rockies, Manning and Graham surely reminisced about their 2-decade-long partnership, even as they schemed a future when the evangelist would hold revivals in each Canadian city, including Winnipeg. It is safe to say that in between golf rounds, meanwhile, Manning and Pugh talked theology in tar sands, and by all accounts, the talks went well. Whatever differences they held politically, Pugh and Manning's soft diplomacy seemed to work. As their connections deepened, it became apparent to Pugh that Manning's populism served as protective cover for what was at its core an ideology of individualism, individualism and an ideology that was shared. Manning, for his part, seemed ready to soften some of the populist defensiveness he had inherited from social credit. His mentors and champion more forcefully a form of free market economy that Pugh upheld. As Pugh and Manning's relationship warmed, so did the Great Canadian Oil Sands dealings with the Alberta government. By 1965, the summer of 65, it was all systems go. Excited by this, hundreds of workers made their way to northern Alberta. Laterno scrapers, shovels, and oversized dump trucks made their way too, ready to carve out the muskeg and scrub timber lining the Great Canadian Oil Sands plant site and burrow below the muskeg to reach pay dirt. Through their multifaceted outreach, Manning and Pugh, Graham and Laterno thus shaped a world enterprise from beginning to end. By 1967, 3,000 workers had labored round the clock, turning a $235 million investment into the world's first commercial venture to produce synthetic crude out of bitumen. This investment and these efforts, Great Canadian Oil Sands announced, stood as, quote, a tribute to man's inventiveness and determination to overcome the obstacles of nature and to signal that the dawn of a new age had arrived. It is no wonder that the oil sands opening ceremony in 1967 pulsated to a Protestant beat. Invocations blended with corporate declarations as the congratulations flowed. This venture, a Great Canadian Oil Sands voice announced, combines drama, man against nature, daring, the risk of large financial resources, and science. The technology of the operation is itself a fascinating story. It is a pioneering undertaking in more than one respect. Such was the appeal of the Wildcatter's logic. Laterno could not have said it any better to his students in Texas, nor Pugh to his employees in Philadelphia, nor Manning to his voters in Calgary and fans worldwide. We'll return to the Canadian oil sands tomorrow morning, even as the oil sands project came to fruition, culminating a 3-decade ascent of Wildcat Christianity. It also helped inaugurate a new era of influence for those who saw the world J. Howard Pugh's way. To what extent we still sense this influence is a question we'll contemplate further. But we will also map out some of the more recent developments in Alberta and Texas and points in between that have challenged conventional carbon gospels and made God and black gold going concerns for other reasons. In the process, we'll ask what it means for these twin pillars of American exceptionalism now that America's century is over, and now that the dynamics that forced American oil to go global are bouncing back on North America and redefining the blessings and curses of the hydrocarbon age. Thank you.